Welcome, everyone, to today's executive briefing. We're going to go ahead and skip the usual pleasantries today because, honestly, we have a really critical explainer to get through. It's an urgent case study on disruption, and frankly, it's a massive warning sign for absolutely anyone steering a major company. Today, we are diving into a strategic postmortem on what is arguably the most famous corporate misstep in modern business history. We're talking about the $50 million mistake.
Now, I want you to imagine sitting right here in this exact boardroom. You're looking across the table and you are offered the chance to acquire a struggling, practically unknown startup for exactly $50 million. This is a company that's actively losing money, and they seem almost entirely irrelevant to your super profitable core business model. Now imagine looking at that $50 million figure on the table and just saying no.
Well, that single no led to that same tiny startup eventually becoming worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Meanwhile, the towering industry giant you were steering, it totally collapsed. This isn't just some theoretical business school exercise. This is exactly what happened when Blockbuster rejected Netflix. So our central thesis for the boardroom today is this. How did a tiny startup completely defeat one of the biggest companies in America? How does an untouchable giant fall so far and so incredibly fast? To really unpack this failure and pull out the strategies we need, let's just quickly walk through our agenda. First, the Blockbuster baseline. Then, the $50 million mistake itself. Next, the innovator's trap, followed by the Netflix disruption, the fall of a giant, and finally, some crucial strategic lessons. Let's dive right into this. All right, Section 1. The Blockbuster baseline, strength and vulnerability. Let's transport ourselves back to the 1990s, way before smartphones or high-speed internet were really a thing. If you wanted to watch a movie back then, you really only had two options: buy it or rent it. And one company was the undisputed, absolute king of home entertainment. At its absolute peak, Blockbuster operated over 9,000 stores worldwide. Just let that massive scale sink in for a second. Every single weekend, families were flocking to these physical locations, wandering those aisles of new releases. They were pulling in nearly $6 billion in annual revenue. They had immense global brand recognition. To anyone looking at their balance sheet, they looked completely unstoppable. But there's a really stark contrast between perception and reality here. Their perceived strength was those billions in revenue and universal brand trust. But lurking right beneath that surface was a dangerous hidden weakness. A huge chunk of their profits, up to $800 million a year actually, came from literally penalizing their own customers. People would forget to return movies on time, and Blockbuster slapped them with a fee. Customers absolutely hated these late fees, but Blockbuster's financial model, it loved them. They relied heavily on a revenue stream that actively frustrated their user base, and that created a massive, massive vulnerability. Which brings us to Section 2, the $50 million mistake, the missed deal. So while Blockbuster was busy raking in those late fees, out in California, two entrepreneurs named Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph had a totally different vision. In 1997, they launched a startup proposing a DVD by mail model. You order online, the movie shows up at your house, and crucially, no late fees, ever. But in 1997, online shopping is still kind of new. Growth is super slow, investors are definitely not impressed, and they are just bleeding money. By the year 2000, Netflix is really struggling, and they desperately need a lifeline. They somehow score a meeting with Blockbuster and pitch them this deal. Blockbuster buys Netflix for $50 million, and in exchange, Netflix will handle all of Blockbuster's online business. But Blockbuster's leadership just passed. They look at their massive retail cash flow, saw Netflix as this weird little distraction, and walked away, choosing to rely entirely on their physical stores. Moving on to Section 3, the innovator's trap, the psychology of success. We really need to understand the psychology behind that boardroom decision because, honestly, it happens in boardrooms just like ours every single day. It brings us to a core business theory that explains their complete blindness. It's called the innovator's trap. And basically, it's defined as becoming a prisoner of your own current success. When your business model is generating billions, changing it feels incredibly risky. But here is the critical sequence we've got to remember. Success creates comfort, comfort drastically reduces urgency, and urgency is exactly what you need for innovation. Without it, companies inevitably fail to adapt, and they vastly underestimate new threats. I want you to really put yourselves in the shoes of those Blockbuster execs for a minute. They were tasked with protecting a highly successful, present-day revenue stream. It is so easy to sit in a nice boardroom, look at those soaring profits from 9,000 retail stores, and ask, maybe with just a tiny bit of hubris, why fix what isn't broken? But the fundamental flaw in that thinking is forgetting that markets never, ever stop evolving.
That brings us to Section 4, the Netflix disruption, accelerating into the future.
That relentless market evolution, that is exactly what Netflix capitalized on. While Blockbuster was aggressively protecting the present, Netflix was accelerating straight into the future. They understood something absolutely crucial. Technology was advancing fast, specifically internet speeds, which meant digital distribution was a looming reality. Step 1 for them was establishing that mail-order DVD model without those hated late fees, building incredible customer loyalty. Step 2, they started heavily investing in digital distribution tech, even while everybody else thought it was just some niche experiment. And finally, Step 3, they launched instant streaming. No physical inventory, no shipping, no returns, you just press play. They saw streaming as the absolute future and they went all in. If you look at the operational differences between the two models, it is literally night and day. Blockbuster was dragged down by this heavy physical infrastructure and millions of physical copies of inventory. It made them incredibly slow-moving. Netflix, on the other hand, built a remarkably light digital platform. Zero physical inventory to manage. In a market that was shifting that fast, Blockbuster's 9,000 stores went from being their greatest asset to a fatal burden. Speed was Netflix's ultimate competitive weapon.
Which leads us right into Section 5, the fall of a giant. Too little, too late. Now, to be completely fair to Blockbuster, they didn't ignore the internet forever. They did eventually launch online services, and they even dropped their late fees around 2004. But here's the thing. They were reacting. They weren't leading. And in shifting markets, being too late is honestly often just as bad as not moving at all. By the time we hit pre-2010, Netflix's streaming is expanding globally, perfectly capturing this brand new consumer habit. Meanwhile, in the late 2000s, Blockbuster is watching its store traffic just plummet, and revenues are in free fall as that physical model becomes completely obsolete. And then, the inevitable conclusion. In the year 2010, Blockbuster officially filed for bankruptcy. An entire industry dominant just wiped out by a startup they could have bought for $50 million a decade prior. All right, Section 6, strategic lessons, action items for the board. Listen, this is absolutely the most important part of today's executive briefing. The Blockbuster story, it's not actually about movies. It is about corporate survival. So here are the core rules we need to internalize from this explainer. First, adaptation is mandatory. It's not optional. Second, leadership has to recognize change way before everyone else does. Third, we have to accept that today's success absolutely does not guarantee tomorrow's survival. And most importantly, we have got to be willing to aggressively challenge our own business model before a competitor does it for us. Because compliance and comfort, those are literally the most dangerous threats to our company right now. Which leaves us with this final, kind of chilling question to ask ourselves as we wrap things up today. Look really closely at your current strategies and the decisions we're making right here at this table. Are you just protecting the present, or are you actively building the future? Remember, the greatest threat isn't always that visible competitor you're tracking. Sometimes, it's the future you're choosing to ignore. Let's make sure we never repeat the $50 million mistake. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, everyone. I really hope it provides absolute clarity on what's truly at stake when we talk about innovation.